Okay. Hola. Hello, everyone. Actually, wait. Before I do anything, I want to do this. You never get to get a picture from up here, and it's actually really cool. So, okay. Thank you. Hi, I'm Jacob Kaplan Moss. I am one of the lead developers of Django. I also work at Heroku, so if you would like to talk to me about any of those things, you can find me. I'll be around all day. So this is going to be a pretty informal little talk. The organizers had asked me to tell you a little bit about where Django is now and where it's going. So I'm going to do that. It's going to be kind of short and high level, and then I'll take some questions for a while. I'll be giving another talk this afternoon about more about Python in general, and more of an organized talk with more of a point. This is just some informal information about where we are and where we're going. So, okay, so they titled this talk "The Future of Django," but really that's not entirely accurate. Before I say anything about the future of Django, I need to make it clear that it's an open source project, I'm guessing. I'm probably better informed than many people, but really the future of Django is what the community makes of it, and that means all of you. Collectively, you have more control over the future of Django than I do. We follow what our community wants. The bulk of our code is contributed by community members. So ultimately, the future of Django is what you make of it. So the further I get into the future, the more distant I talk about, the less accurate this talk is going to be. So just keep that in mind. A year from now, 2 years from now, we can maybe look back over the video and see how accurate I really was. All right, Django 1.6 probably will come out next week. So this part is pretty accurate. Except maybe the next week part. The release candidate is out now. I encourage you all to try it if you possibly can. The reason we release a candidate rather than the final release is to give people a chance to try it out before we do the actual release. The code that's out now will be the actual release unless we hear something. So if you try it out and it doesn't work, we would like to hear about it. So what's new in 1.6? There's some pretty cool stuff. There's a new transaction management regime, which can loosely be described as not totally broken. How many of you have tried to do transaction management in Django before? Yeah, I see some hands. Pretty painful? It's not great. It has a lot of bugs. It makes some assumptions about your database engine that isn't always true. So the new model is quite a bit better. It has some additional features like support for nested transactions, which is very nice. Yeah, and it's pretty great. Unfortunately, it's not backwards compatible. Basically, the old behavior was so broken that we couldn't save it. It had to be done. So you will have to spend some time if you use transactions in Django doing some upgrade work to get to 1.6. It's worth it though because it's no longer buggy and broken. Along with this comes persistent database connections. So previously, Django would create a new connection to your database at the beginning of the request and then close it at the end. This isn't a problem when your database is very local to your machine. If you're in a traditional hosting environment that you control with very fast switches and maybe only 1 or 2 hops between your web and your database servers. But as more and more of us move our software stacks to the cloud, the time to establish a new connection in an environment like Amazon gets longer and longer. We were seeing numbers from users of upwards of 90% of the time per request just being spent setting up and tearing down a database connection. That's totally unacceptable. So now Django will maintain a persistent connection. Each thread has its own connection that's reused across requests. And so this, you either won't notice this at all, or you'll notice a dramatic performance increase if you're on something like AWS or Heroku or Rackspace or something like that. So big performance increase there. We have a better test discovery system. Remember how you have to do this thing where if you want to split your tests into multiple files, you have to put them in a tests directory and then have an init file which imports each of your other test files. Yeah, I see people nodding. It's a pain in the butt. No longer true. Django will now properly discover tests the way it should have. We're also, so Django 1.5, we said supported Python 3, but we said it was experimental. That was just us sort of hedging our bets. It had never been used in production before. You know, Django 1.5 was the first release that had Python 3 support, and we didn't want to call something production quality unless we knew that it was. Well, now Django 1.5 and Python 3 have been used in production for close to a year. We haven't really seen any bugs specifically related to Python 3. The performance is about the same. We're happy with it. So we're officially calling it done. Django 1.6 has production quality Python 3 support. If that's what you were waiting for to move to Python 3, it's done. And there's quite a few other things in Django 1.6, mostly smaller. I invite you to check out the notes. The other thing that's coming along with Django 1.6, so normally we maintain two versions of Django at once, the current release and the previous release. So right now it's 1.4 and 1.5. And when 1.6 is released, we would have end-of-life 1.4. How many of you are using Django 1.4 of the people using Django? Yeah, I see a lot of people out there. That's because 1.4 is only 16 or 18 months old. It's not a very, we've accelerated our release cycle somewhat. It used to be longer than a year, and now it's getting to be more like 9 months, and maybe even 6 after that. So we've decided that from time to time, we will declare certain releases of Django as long-term support, LTS, copying what Ubuntu does. And this means that we'll officially support them, providing updates to address security bugs or really bad data loss or crasher bugs for 5 years. So at least until March 2015, we'll be supporting Django 1.4. Okay, so Django 1.7. One of the reasons we've been able to accelerate our release cycle is because we've already started work on 1.7. We started work on 1.7 around when we released 1.6 alpha, so we're actually working on 2 versions simultaneously now. It's real fun for merging patches between different branches. I hope that this will be out within maybe 9 to 12 months. I'd like to aim for quicker, and you'll understand why in a minute. But hopefully we'll have this out reasonably soon. So some new things. These are already in. We've dropped support for Python 2.6. So Django 1.7 only supports Python 2.7. This is part of our sort of gradual move to deprecate older versions of Python and encourage you to upgrade. In particular, 2.7 is significantly faster faster and uses less memory than previous versions. There was the memory allocator in 2.6 and below was kind of broken. So you probably want to be upgrading to 2.7 anyway. So maybe Django will encourage you to do so. Small feature, but something people have been asking for a while, is a update or create method on models. So we added that now. That's nice. And then a couple of things that are in progress. Summer of Code project this year added support for composite primary keys, so using multiple columns for a primary key. This has been something people have been asking for a while. It's the biggest missing feature from our ORM. And the work is done. Merging it is complicated. It was a race between this feature and another one, and the other one won, and so now there's a lot of updating that has to happen. But hopefully we'll be able to make that work and get that in. It would be a pretty cool feature. Another Summer of Code project added a command called check deploy. The idea behind here is that Django would automatically check for a lot of the common configuration errors that you make when you put your app into production. So simple things like debug being off, but also more complex security configuration and issues like that. And the idea here is, we know that people make these mistakes because we see them on the mailing lists over and over again, and we ought to be able to check for them before you even deploy. So you would run this command just before you push your code to production, and it would tell you whether everything's kind of ready to go. Think of it as like a pre-deploy checklist. Again, here the work is done, but it hasn't been merged yet, so there's some difficulty that always takes some time. If you want to follow along, the release notes are already available, and you can follow them on the web and watch as we add new stuff, or just watch us on GitHub. Now, there's one other feature I didn't mention that I'm holding till last because it's like the really cool, awesome feature that's been missing from Django since day one. One of the biggest things that we've been lacking. And also let me use the new Keynote fireworks effect. Wait, boy, check this out. Oh yeah, I love it. So yeah, schema migration. This is already done. This is checked in. If you check Django out from GitHub right now, you get a version of Django that has built-in schema migration. This is super cool. This has been something people have been asking for years and years and years. Andrew Godwin, who was the creator of South, which became sort of the de facto standard migration library for Django, had a Kickstarter project, asked for money to let him take some time off work to write a new version of South that included in Django. He raised 4 times what he asked for, almost 30,000 pounds, and was able to do even more than he had planned to do, including releasing a version backwards compatible with older versions of Django. And it's now in. There are still a few rough edges. There are some bits that it doesn't quite do yet. That's fine. 1.7 isn't final or anywhere close to it, but yeah, it's in. You can use it. It's really exciting. So this is the reason that I really want to. I hope that we can get 1.7 out pretty quickly, if we can, because it's a big deal, and I don't think we need any other features besides this one. Okay, so a couple thoughts on where we might be going after this. Now, this is super speculative. This is very, very dreaming. There's not a lot of real work being done here yet. They're just kind of things I think that they're in the air that people are thinking about. So the first one is NoSQL. It's pretty clear now that NoSQL isn't a fad. It isn't just a little thing that is going to come and go. There's some important reasons you might want to use a NoSQL database, and it's a real thing. And Django doesn't really have direct support for it in any form. Now, it's unclear to me exactly what NoSQL support in Django would look like. Some people, I think, have this idea that they would write their app against a relational database, and then one day decide to switch and go into their settings and change their database engine to a non-relational database, and poof, now they'd be on NoSQL. That's a dream. That's impossible. Relational and non-relational databases require very different ways of thinking about your app, and even different non-relational databases. Building an app against MongoDB is very different than building an app against Cassandra. Those two tools have very little in common. Even to call them under the same term is somewhat misleading. It's like talking about a bicycle and a tank and saying, oh, they're both vehicles. And it's not really it's not a great comparison. So what this means, what NoSQL support for Django would actually mean, is a little bit confusing and complicated. I think in practice it will fall down more along the lines of protocols and extension hooks. So you can do things like have auth that's backed by a NoSQL database, or maybe have the admin work against NoSQL databases. But the idea of a single model layer that supports both relational and every flavor of non-relational databases seems nearly impossible to me. You know, it's notable that the fork of Django, Django non-rel, that adds support for non-relational databases actually only supports 2 non-relational databases, and they're 2 that have a lot in common. So then it's not exactly even non-rel, it's these 2 types of non-relational databases. So it's complicated to know exactly what this is going to mean for Django. But I think it's something we have to figure out and something we have to do because, again, you know, our users determine our future and our users want this. Another thing that's happening in the web in general is that the definition of what a web app is seems to be changing. We used to talk about web applications as we had this back-end component and it would do almost all the work, and at the end it would kind of shove this large ball of HTML to the browser where it would be rendered. I think in 5 or 10 years, we're going to look back on that and laugh at it and say, whoever developed an application like that? And the reason for this is we're seeing now a real rise in the capabilities of what the front end can do. What we think of as a web app has changed a lot, from you know, technologies like HTML5 and better JavaScript support, CSS3, to an improvement in front-end frameworks that allow the types of things we used to have to do on the back end to now be done on the front end, but also including mobile applications, right? There are a lot of web apps that actually the front end isn't even HTML at all. And so the role of the server in a development of a web application is changing. The idea of the server as doing most of the work and then rendering this ball of HTML, I think is going to end. I think it's going to go away. And instead we're going to have rich clients communicating with servers and exchanging data rather than exchanging, you know, rendered HTML. So things like APIs become a lot more important. And again, this is something that's not built into Django, so we would have to think about, you know, what is the role of a server-side framework in a world where more and more work moves to the client side. Finally, the so-called real-time web or asynchronous frameworks. This is a very real thing. Most server-side applications are fundamentally I/O bound. And if you try to run those kinds of applications under a threaded model, you end up wasting a lot of time. And further, as these front-end applications become more and more powerful, the type of communication they want to do with the back-end is changing from this exchange of little bits of data to lots of data going back and forth where holding a persistent connection is useful, even up to things like WebRTC, which enables video and audio communication browser to browser or browser to server. We need a different type of web server to be able to support this kind of work. It's the tools we have right now in Python simply won't cut it. Luckily, there is some good news here. This is a video of Emmerich Augustine, one of the other Django developers, speaking at DjangoCon last month, a couple months ago. And he's been working with the people writing this, this library called Tulip. Tulip is a new asynchronous framework for Python, and it will be built into the next version of Python, into Python 3.4. And Emmerich has been doing a lot of work around integrating Tulip and Django. And the good news is the APIs are beautiful. And I'll talk about this more in my next talk. The bad news is there's still a ton of work to be done here. So we have some good news on the asynchronous front, but we also have a lot of work to do there. So if any of this sounded exciting, if you want to help us out, if you want to make these crazy dreams a reality, I would invite you to join us. We have because we're obsessive about documentation, we have documentation about how to contribute to Django that will step you through from your first contributions into what's involved in becoming a committer. We have a pretty open development community. You can jump in, join us on IRC, join us on the mailing list. And if you want to work on any of these things, we would love some help. Yeah, thanks.
¿Preguntas?
Hey, thanks for the speak. I want to ask you if there is any planning of upgrading the admin contrib app in the timeline.
Yeah, the admin, it's showing its age, isn't it? The admin was created in 2003 and it hasn't changed very much since then. It's been, the insides have been rewritten a few times, but the user interface and the basic workflow is almost a decade old. There aren't really any concrete plans. It's a difficult thing. I'm a firm believer in the open source model and in more people making code better, but I don't think that user interface works that way. I think user interface it benefits from a single, strong, coherent vision. And the admin was written by one designer and one developer sitting in a basement, literally in a basement. Our office at the newspaper was in the basement because that's where you put the programmers, right? Yeah, so I think it's going to take, I think that developing a new admin as a community is probably a dead end and may not happen. It's been attempted many, many times and it always fizzles out. There's too much argument and discussion. There are too many directions it could go. I think it's going to take someone or a small group of people getting together with a real focused effort and just doing something, making the decisions and releasing something. And maybe it's a big risk. Maybe that will be a dead end and it'll always be an external thing and never make it part into Django. And maybe they'll get it right and it'll be something that everyone wants to be in Django. But that's the only way I would see that actually happening.
Thanks.
Good question, thank you.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Thanks for the talk. When you speak of the rise of the front end and also the role of asynchronous applications, does that mean, or do you envisage that in the future Django will focus more only on the server side to enable these applications, or will it also evolve on the front end?
I think you probably don't want to trust us to do front-end development. That's not what we're good at. So I think that there's always going to be a server-side component. The downside of this push to mobile is that our phones aren't nearly as capable as even desktop computers. JavaScript, an interpreted language running in a browser on a device with limited memory is way slower when I can get a server from Amazon that has 250 gigabytes of RAM. So I think there's always a role for a server-side framework, and I think that's what we're good at, and that's where our focus will stay. I think probably there will be a shrinking of what server-side frameworks do, and maybe we'll find a really good match in some other front-end framework, but yeah.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Bueno, thank you, Jacob.